evening. It's Wednesday, it's 7:30. It's not Top of the Pops, I think that was Thursday. It is another half-hour hangout. So second attempt at one of these simulcasts, and hopefully some of you may have watched last week's session on resilience and the Weeble theory. And just as a reminder, Mr. Weeble, whose name is Marshall, I found out. So Marshall is still with me. And today's subject really, I suppose, links on a little bit and was prompted by a comment from Dave Pageant. If you're watching or listening on a listen back or whatever you call it when you watch a recorded video, one of the things that prompted a question from him and a bit of a reflection even from me was around this idea of resilience, and almost maybe are we a question as to whether we as people or Weebles actually are stationary until something knocks us over, or whether as humans we have a tendency to want to seek things out that challenge us or test us. So that got me thinking about something that I'd started looking at a few years ago, and it just brought it back to mind, and I thought I'd talk through it and share it, and just reflect and muse over a few things this evening, which I've called Newton's laws for life, and then a big question mark. And I should start by saying that I'm not a physicist, I'm definitely not a scientist, and in fact physics was one of the subjects that actually dropped at secondary school as soon as I possibly could, because I just didn't get it, and I didn't see its relevance, I didn't understand necessarily what it was all about. And it wasn't until a couple of years ago, or a few years ago, that when I was working within golf, and a lot of their technical work is based on laws of physics. So the way a golf ball's hit and moves and all these other things. And I kind of started thinking, okay, well, maybe it starts to make sense. And then a few years later, I sat sort of thinking and reflecting on life in general, and I can't even remember what it was that prompted me to think about it. But I went and had a look at Newton's laws of motion and started to kind of maybe think about them in a different way, and perhaps begin to understand them a little. So I thought I'd just share with you some of my reflections and thoughts in this session, and leave you to ponder going forward. So if I'm talking to myself, then hey, nothing's new. I'm quite happy to amuse myself. But if you're listening either live or listening on Listen Again, or I can't think of the word, listening to a recording, watching a recording, then I just hope this maybe prompts something. And please, as ever, drop me a message, get in touch. We can have a virtual coffee, because I really enjoy talking about these things and just mulling them over a little bit, and really welcome any sort of thoughts and comments back, because it just helps me keep refining my thinking and seeing where I can take things and make connections between things like the resilience conversation of last week with some of this thoughts that I'll share with you now. So to start with, let's just have a look at what Newton's laws are. And again, big caveat is this is a layman's interpretation of Newton's laws, and this is me going and looking and trying to make sense of them a little bit. And if we take Newton's laws, there are three of them, and probably to some extent many of you will know of them, be able to quote some of them. But I'll just give an introduction into the laws first, and then I'll sort of start to give my different take on it and view it through a slightly different lens, and come back to that Newton's laws for life question mark. So Newton's first law of motion is the law of inertia, and effectively, I'm going to read this so I don't get it wrong. It says, a body will remain at rest, or a body in motion will remain in motion unless it is acted upon by an external force. So really simply, if something's stationary, it's going to stay stationary until something else comes along and kicks it or moves it. And I thought maybe I could use a golf analogy and just bring it to life in a sense. So you're at the golf driving range, you've got a nice stable tee, and you put your golf ball on that tee. And assuming there's no wind, it's a lovely, still, calm day. The automatic tee machine is working perfectly, so it's not going to suddenly disappear. That golf ball is going to stay on that tee until something else happens to it. So perhaps, if it is a windy day, perhaps the wind will blow it off. So a force comes and moves it off from its perch. Perhaps a creature will come out of the undergrowth and run off with a ball. A dog maybe will come and run off with it. But probably what's most likely to happen is that you'll line up your shot and with the golf club will hit the ball. And Newton's first law effectively says that that golf ball will stay in its stationary place until something comes along and moves it, which in this case will be a golf ball. The second part of that law of inertia then comes into play because what Newton suggested is that that golf ball will continue on the path on its trajectory until other forces act on it. And it's perhaps less obvious in those cases because it's not as obvious as a golf club hitting it and starting that movement. But there'll be the gravity will pull it down to earth. Air turbulence, air pressure, perhaps the spin on the ball will impact on where it's going. So there'll be lots of external forces that will impact on where that ball goes. And it's not just going to continue on forever on that one trajectory. In our atmosphere and with everything else around us, it will come back to Earth. And then it will remain at rest until something else hits it. And you can think about these things as well. If you're kicking a football, if you're picking something up, it's actually not going to move unless something comes along and causes it to move. So hopefully that's a really brief insight into Newton's first law. And again, I'll welcome any further insights that can help me understand it even more. But Newton's first law, law of inertia. Second law then comes under this idea of law of acceleration. And the equation that you may have seen associated with this is F equals ma, where F is force, m is mass, and a is acceleration. So force equals mass times acceleration. And again, I'll read this. It says, the force acting on an object is equal to the mass of that object times its acceleration. So I guess in really simple terms, this suggests that the heavier an object causing that impact, and the faster that object is going, the more force it will exert. Therefore, the faster it will move that object that it's impacting with. So again, if we go back to the golf club and golf ball analogy, if you happen to tap that golf ball really gently with a really small swing and perhaps a plastic club, plastic club's fairly light and you're just waving at it, that ball's not going to go very far because the force that you create isn't very significant. However, if you're using a much heavier, weightier club, one of the iron, an iron, or perhaps even one of the older drivers with a wooden head or something like that, and you're swinging the club really fast, so your swing speed is high, the force that you create is going to be much bigger, and the impact on the ball will be more significant and potentially it will go further. So that's in really simple terms, I hope, this idea that force equals mass times acceleration, which is Newton's second law. So the bigger and heavier and faster an object, actually sorry, not the bigger, the heavier and faster something is moving, the more force or impact it will create. And lastly is Newton's third law, which is the law of interaction. And potentially this is the one that most people will have heard of. And in simple terms, it says for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. So, I've got this image of swing ball in my head for some reason, because I think that seems to be really popular again at the moment. Lots of people seem to be playing swing ball or trying to get hold of swing ball. So you can imagine yourself playing swing ball and the ball's going round and somebody hits it one way. And then in order to play the game, somebody else hits it back the other way. So again, you're creating that force and switching things. So, a backhand one way is going to cause the ball to swing arguably anti-clockwise, and then somebody else who's playing against you will hit a ball with a certain amount of force, and that will cause the ball to go back around the other way. And what Newton suggests is that is an equal and opposite reaction. So it's paired, and I've also got in my head the little swinging desk toys where you pull the ball out one end and it pings the ball out and it goes back the other way. And I think that, in my head at least, is demonstrating that idea that for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction. And I think this is where all the laws interact, because inevitably those sorts of things aren't going to carry on forever. Gradually a force will interact and they'll slow down. And also how far the swing ball and how fast the swing ball goes depends on how hard you hit it and what bat you move it with. And also it's only going to change direction or move in the first place if you hit it. So all of these laws generally, I think, seem to sort of interact and merge. So I kind of started thinking about the Weeble and the resilience theory, and also, the prompt from Dave last week in terms of saying, well, if we're people, do we actively, and I'm paraphrasing here, do we actively seek out these challenges that potentially knock us down, or do we just kind of go along and sometimes things happen? And this is where I started maybe pondering Newton's laws of life and translating them and looking at them in terms of how we live, grow, develop and learn. And here's what I'm going to suggest. So again, this is me putting something out there based on my reflections and thinking, and maybe let's start a conversation about it and see if it resonates with you and means anything. So how about if we looked at Newton's first law and just changed the context? So law of inertia talks about a body remaining at rest or in motion unless acted upon by an external force. What if we look at it and say life will remain constant or continue along the same path until something comes along to nudge that life in a new direction? So maybe that could be a major life event, a learning experience, a conversation, or something that happens on a daily basis. So, it could be that we're quite happily sat somewhere. So I'm thinking of the Weeble. Maybe the Weeble is just sat and not wobbling, and it only wobbles until something comes along and kicks it in that direction, which is like Newton's first law. But also thinking about life's career path or trajectory, or wherever we choose to go. If we're moving in one direction, we will only change that path or stop or shift in a different direction if something happens to influence us and push us into another direction. So that could be you lose your job. That could be we're faced with a big pandemic and it just throws everything out. It could be as simple as having a conversation with somebody new that you'd never talked to before. It could be watching a new TV program. It could be learning, listening to a podcast that sparks something and just kind of nudges you in a different direction. So I guess I just wonder whether that's that idea that we're stationary or we're on a path unless something comes along to nudge us in a slightly different direction. And perhaps that's where learning and growing and shifting and changing happens. And all of those experiences help us be more certain about who we are. But maybe that's a whole other conversation. So let's look at Newton's second law and then apply that sort of similar lens to that second law, which is force equals mass times acceleration. So the greater the force, it means a great force will have greater mass and greater speed. So what if we said that the impact of a life event will depend on the size and speed at which it hits? So, for example, maybe a major life event, and I've just scribbled a few down here: children, marriage, death, divorce, illness, pandemic. I'll add that in. Maybe some of those will have a greater impact than everyday interactions, like strangers saying hello or noticing something in the garden for the first time. Maybe. But equally, I do wonder about that because sometimes just a smile or a word from a stranger can have a huge impact if you're not feeling in such a great place that day. However, if we look at the speed idea as well, and perhaps think about the speed at which events occur maybe influences that impact. So perhaps if we know an event is coming, it maybe gives us time to prepare, to plan. So the likelihood of it knocking us off our path is maybe slightly less. However, if something happens that's incredibly unexpected, then maybe it has the potential to push us really off that path, or if we go back to our Weeble friend, to really knock us down instead of just gently nudging us a little bit. And again, if we look at that, it's a multiplier effect. So Newton's second law says force equals mass times acceleration. So it's the combination of both of them. So perhaps that explains why an unexpected kind deed from a stranger could have a big impact, because actually it's the unexpected nature of us and the speed which it hits which multiplies that potential size effect. And equally, perhaps, I don't know, I'm not necessarily speaking from personal experience, but perhaps something like having time to prepare for a major event in life mitigates slightly the massive impact that clearly it will have in terms of the size and weight and hole or whatever it might leave in your life. So, again, I just wonder, it did get me thinking around that force equals mass times acceleration and how we understand why different events in our lives feel like they maybe impact on us and shift our paths more than perhaps other events in life. So, Newton's third law, for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. So what does that look like? And what did that mean for me when I started thinking in terms of this kind of life lens? And I started, maybe in my head, I'd got this image of being at an impasse with somebody. So this kind of idea that, for every action, so if this is pushing this way, then this is going to be pushing this way. And if we stay there and they're equal and opposite reactions, then we don't necessarily move. So maybe it's an argument with somebody where you are absolutely adamant that you're right, but the harder you push that you're right and you're arguing your case, the harder the other person pushes back and argues their case. And maybe even it's, the shouting gets louder, or, the fierceness gets even more intense. And it's how we kind of recognise that sort of equal and opposite reaction. And, maybe I think about sometimes in my life when I've come across a block almost, and it's almost like the harder you push because you want something to happen, it feels like the harder it's pushing back against you and things maybe feel impossible. So, I did start to think, well, actually, maybe that is the case in life. And so how do we deal with that? How do I, understand that? And I think for me, in this instance, it's not necessarily about, recognizing and trying to fight back, because it's kind of natural to fight back and argue our case in a lot of times, and often we expend a huge amount of energy doing that. What it made me think, though, is coming to this idea of choice and having a choice, and also awareness. So I wonder, and I have wondered, whether we can kind of use that equal and opposite reaction to our advantage, and kind of know and start to realise when we're in those situations, maybe slightly earlier. So knowing that if you're pushing against what feels like a brick wall, and I think back to maybe times in my professional life, my career, my personal life, when you've desperately wanted something and you're really pushing hard, but you're not getting anywhere, and it just feels like you've reached that impasse point. And I wonder now whether, if I had been more aware of those instances and that realisation that, okay, this is Newton's law, third law in action, I'm pushing and somebody's pushing back against me. I wonder whether if I'd have stopped and paused and just thought about things a little bit and just almost eased back a little bit and kind of gone, okay, well, how do I, instead of keeping and wasting energy on pushing back, how do I perhaps shift my path? How do I maybe use that and take that back to almost law one, where actually, this is something that's just knocking me off my path, instead of pushing against it. And what can I learn? How can I get around this? I don't know. Or how can I find a way to see this from the other person's perspective, rather than just arguing against, and neither of us getting anywhere. So I sort of wondered whether, if we recognise the impact of that force on our thinking and behaviour and chose to act in a different way, and maybe we could simply step aside and allow the force. So we step this way and just go, do you know what? I can't influence this at this point in time. So you just let that other force go past you and see where it ends. Or perhaps we maybe try and gently nudge it in another direction. And I'm not sure if I remember this rightly, but I'm sure, I've got this vague recollection of being in a self-defence class at secondary school, and the self-defence teacher sort of saying, if somebody comes and they're pushing you, actually, if you just try and divert that force a little bit, it takes some of the energy out of it, just kind of pushes it in a slightly different direction. So instead of pushing back, you push to the side. Now, I can't remember if that's right or I've made that up totally, but it just jumped in my head when I was thinking about these things, and thought, okay, I wonder if that does work. But it did make me think in this instance, okay, I think I reflect back and think, how much wasted energy and time have I lost almost by fighting and pushing against something, when actually if I'd have maybe just stepped back or paused and thought about either, okay, how can I see this from that other side? and what else could I do? What other approach could I take? So that instead of reaching this impasse, actually we're able to either two people or however many people it was in that sort of impasse being able to move positively in a different direction, or actually realise that actually this fight isn't worth it. Which sometimes I think, we need to make those decisions for ourselves and go, okay, maybe now's not the time to have that discussion. Maybe I just need to leave it for another day. So anyway, that's really, I suppose, a bit of a reflection on my take on Newton's laws of motion, and maybe just thinking about, could we just think about how they apply to life and build on from that, the Weibull theory, and kind of give us this idea of, how our path in life moves, and when we do see those different forces acting on us, what they mean for us and how we can then accept them or work through them or point in a different direction. So just to, I suppose, as a brief summary and a recap, law 1, Newton's law 1 is the law of inertia. Body will remain at rest or in motion unless it's acted upon by an external force. So in terms of our life path or our career path or whatever we want to say, perhaps our life path will remain constant or stationary until something comes along to nudge us in that different direction. And, thinking about the question and the exchange with Dave, if you're listening, watching, maybe some people seek that out, maybe others, how do we know what's going to knock us off on our path? And maybe some people, maybe we do seek that force out. But also I think there's something in there that allows us to recognise that sometimes things that happen to us are really unexpected and we're stationary and they come along and just completely knock us out of direction. But maybe what that also enables us to do is say, actually we can also be moving already. So it isn't about waiting for something to come along, it's about us being proactive, and we are that golf ball that's already travelling through the air because something somewhere nudged us in the right direction, and then it's those other things that come out of the blue that maybe impact on us. I don't know, lots of questions in my mind as I'm working through that. Newton's second law, really simply, law of acceleration, force equals mass times acceleration. So again, for me, what I took that to mean is that things that happen to us, it depends on the size and the speed at which it hits. So something very small but unexpected could actually have the same impact as something very big but not unexpected and that we were preparing for and aware of. But anything in between. So it's that combination of the size and the magnitude of the event and the speed at which it's coming and whether we can see it happening and coming or not. And finally, that law of interaction, for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction. I suppose it's awareness for me, and realizing that as much as that applies to physical mass objects, it applies to us as humans and our will and our willpower and our desire to get something done and push it over a line or get something happening. We can meet resistance coming that's equally as strong in the other direction, and the more we push, the more that person pushes back. For some reason, I'm thinking of parents and children, and pushing boundaries and wanting things and testing willpower. I don't know why that's suddenly come into my head, but it's that idea of the more you push, the more somebody pushes back against you. And perhaps actually, if we can become aware that that is happening and understand that law of motion, of Newton's law, and see that happens in life as well, we can just think about, okay, can I have a choice? It's a conscious choice. Do I keep pushing and potentially not get anywhere? Do I want to stand my ground and actually I'm not accepting anything different? Or actually, do I want to just pause, step back a little bit and see if there's another way of doing things? Or can I understand where that other perspective is coming from, or find a different way around? For me, I think that's about choice, and that we don't have to feel like that confrontation or that impasse is zapping all of our energy and efforts, and becoming aware that there are other ways of maybe overcoming that object. So that's me for tonight. A little under half an hour, so it's kind of nearly a half-hour hangout. But hope you have had a good week. I really genuinely hope that something, even if it's one thing that I've said tonight, sparks question or a query or some thinking in your mind, get in touch. Drop me a message on Twitter at Opus29Jane, Facebook, LinkedIn, email jane@opus29.co.uk. Get in touch. I'd love to chat. Always happy to talk research, theory, ideas, connections, and see where things take us and take my thinking. So thank you for listening, for watching, and I'll probably have another go next week, Wednesday nights at 7:30. And we'll see what subject comes up next week. If there's anything that prompts from any questions that come this week, who knows where it'll take us. And also, if there's anything that you're curious about, then let's go and explore it together and see what happens if we come back together next week. So yeah, thank you for listening, and have a good week. Take care.